Saturday morning in the suburbs of Chicago seemed just like any other. The sky was clear, the air cool, and the streets quiet. Emily was getting ready to go to the supermarket to pick up groceries for dinner. Her life was simple and steady. A husband, Adam, two children, and a house in a peaceful neighborhood. She often thought she had everything anyone could dream of. On this day, nothing hinted at what was to come. The supermarket was just a few blocks from their home, a familiar place where Emily often ran into acquaintances. She paused at the entrance, grabbed a shopping cart, and headed to the produce section. Thoughts about dinner were already swirling in her mind. Chicken steaks or pasta. As she parked her cart near the apple stand, something, or rather someone, caught her attention. It was Adam, her husband. His presence in the supermarket didn't seem strange, but the situation did. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman in her early 30s with long dark hair. She was saying something to him, and he was listening, smiling. Next to them stood a young boy who clung to Adam's hand. The boy gazed up at him with the kind of adoration Emily was used to seeing in her own children's eyes. Emily felt a sudden chill in her fingertips. She ducked behind a display rack to avoid being seen. From her hiding spot, she could hear only fragments of their conversation. The woman asked Adam something, and the boy tugged on Adam's sleeve, calling him Dad. Adam leaned down and responded warmly, his voice carrying the same tenderness Emily instantly recognized. It was her husband, but not her family. She froze, rooted to the spot, watching a scene that felt like it had escaped from a parallel universe. The woman placed a hand on Adam's shoulder, and he gently took her hand in his. It wasn't the gesture of a casual acquaintance. It was something far closer, more intimate. Everything about their body language screamed that they were a family. Emily couldn't bring herself to step out of her hiding place. Her heart pounded so loudly she was afraid someone might hear it. She wanted to march over and demand an explanation, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Could it be a misunderstanding? Yet every smile, every movement they made together felt so natural, so synchronized, that it left little room for doubt. The minutes she spent watching them felt like an eternity. Finally, Emily quietly wheeled her cart away and headed for the exit. She left the supermarket without buying a single item, her mind reeling from what she just witnessed. Who was this woman? Who was this boy? And why was her husband treating them as though they were the most important people in his life? Sitting in her car, Emily struggled to steady her hands on the steering wheel. The images from the store replayed in her mind. Adam's smile, the boy's joy, the woman who seemed to belong so effortlessly by his side. It felt more like a nightmare than reality. Eventually, she decided to drive home. Her mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. She couldn't just let this go. The life that had seemed so stable and peaceful just that morning now felt as fragile as a house of cards. She needed answers. Emily returned home later than planned. The drive, which usually took only 5 minutes, stretched on as she stopped, hesitated, and tried to gather her thoughts. She parked the car in the garage and entered the house, but the familiar comfort of her home now felt hollow and deceitful. The children were laughing loudly in the living room, watching cartoons, and the smell of coffee wafted from the kitchen. Everything seemed so normal, it was almost cruelly ironic. Emily slowly made her way to the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. The scenes from the supermarket kept replaying in her mind. She remembered the boy calling Adam Dad, and that single word cut into her consciousness like a knife. She had always believed she knew everything about her husband, but now that knowledge crumbled like sand slipping through her fingers. It was hard to even fathom that he might be hiding something this big. The bitterness she felt grew stronger with every passing moment. She began to recall all the little things she had previously brushed off. His frequent late nights at work, which he explained as being tied to new projects. The phone calls he always took behind closed doors. The business trips during which he was oddly difficult to reach. Even his sudden interest in new clothes and colognes. At the time, she had thought he was simply trying to add some spark to their marriage, but now those little things took on a completely different meaning. From the moment she crossed the threshold of her home, Emily began to silently observe Adam. He arrived home later than she did, carrying a folder full of work documents. His usual warm smile and kiss on the cheek infuriated her even more. How could he act so casually, as if nothing had happened? At dinner, she barely spoke. The kids excitedly shared stories from their day, while Adam seemed relaxed and happy. He even suggested they watch a family movie after dinner. Emily could barely contain herself. Several times, she caught herself gripping her fork so tightly her fingers began to go numb. Later that evening, Adam, as always, read bedtime stories to the kids. Emily stood in the doorway of their room, watching the scene unfold. He looked so caring, so loving. It was a sight she had seen 100 times before, but now, in light of what she had witnessed earlier that day, it felt unnatural. She felt torn between the two emotions: deep love for the man she had built her life with, and a burning desire to uncover the truth he was hiding. After the children were asleep, Adam returned to the living room, sat on the couch, and began watching a sports channel. Without saying a word, Emily walked past him and locked herself in the bathroom. She turned on the water to drown out any sounds and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked tired, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with her back to Adam, listening to his steady breathing as he slept peacefully. But her mind raced with plans. She knew that confronting him outright wouldn't work. Adam could deny everything, or worse, hide even more. Instead, she needed proof, something undeniable. She thought about his phone, the papers he brought home, and even his car. Any of these could hold the key to the truth, but for now she decided to bide her time. She would watch, analyze, and wait for the right moment. Her thoughts continued to swirl until dawn. When Adam woke up and left for work, Emily had already made up her mind. Her suspicions would mark the beginning of a new chapter. She could no longer sit idly by as a passive observer. She was ready to act. The next morning, Emily tried to act as though nothing had happened. She prepared breakfast for the kids, got them ready for school, and even made small talk with Adam about mundane topics, like their weekend plans. But inside, a storm was raging. Every word, every glance from Adam fueled her suspicions and the pain festering within her. She waited for the moment she would be alone, and it came sooner than expected. Adam was in a rush to meet a client. He grabbed his briefcase, quickly downed his coffee, and in his hurry, left his phone on the kitchen counter as he headed out the door. Emily noticed it while clearing the breakfast dishes. Her heart began to race. She knew this was her chance to find the answers she so desperately needed. The phone lay on the counter, its screen dark and unassuming, while Emily stood motionless, debating with herself. Her conscience whispered that this was wrong, but then the image of the woman and the boy from the supermarket flashed in her mind. Her decision became clear. She sat down at the table, picked up the phone, and pressed the power button. The screen unlocked. The first thing that caught her attention was the messages. At the top of the chat list was a contact labeled simply as B. Emily tapped on it, and what she saw made her heart sink. The messages left no room for ambiguity. I miss you. I can't wait for you to spend the weekend with us. Lucas keeps asking when you'll come home. These were just fragments of a much longer thread. Each word hit her like a punch to the stomach. She kept scrolling, unable to stop herself. The messages were filled with warmth and tenderness, but not the kind she was used to receiving from Adam. These words were meant for someone else. One recent message read, I can't wait for tonight. Same place as usual. Emily's palms grew damp with sweat as she read. Then came the photos. Her hands trembled as she opened the gallery. There were images of Adam with Belinda and Lucas. In one, they were on a picnic. Adam had his arm around Lucas's shoulders, and Belinda was laughing. In another, they were at a birthday party. Lucas was blowing out the candles on his cake while Adam looked on proudly. These weren't casual snapshots. They told the story of a life Adam had been living behind her back. Emily scrolled through picture after picture, each one a knife twisting deeper into her heart. She took screenshots of several images to save as evidence. Her breathing became shallow, and her heart pounded in her chest as though it might burst. Next, she opened the call log. There, too, was proof of frequent communication with B. Calls made during times when Adam had claimed to be working late or in meetings. Further digging revealed financial transactions, dinner bills from fancy restaurants, hotel bookings, and purchases of expensive gifts. It was all there, laid out plainly, confirming everything she had begun to suspect. When Emily finally put the phone back down, her legs felt weak and unsteady. She didn't know what to do next. Her doubts had transformed into an undeniable certainty. This wasn't a question of if anymore. It was only a matter of how long this had been going on. Emily placed the phone back on the counter, but her gaze lingered on it. She now understood that Adam wasn't just lying to her. He had built an entirely separate life, one she hadn't even imagined. That day, a spark of anger ignited deep within her, a rage that couldn't be extinguished. Emily realized there was no going back now. Her life as she knew it had been shattered, and the only thing left was to decide what to do next. The days after Emily's discovery on Adam's phone became a true test of her strength. She tried to act as though everything was normal, but her suspicions and anger continued to simmer beneath the surface. Every look at Adam reignited her pain. She knew she couldn't just sit and wait anymore. She needed more proof, something indisputable, something she could see with her own eyes. The opportunity presented itself when Adam announced one evening that he had a meeting with a client downtown. He gathered some documents in his briefcase, dressed in his best suit, and even sprayed on the new cologne Emily had come to despise. She felt almost certain this was another lie. This time, she decided to take action. As soon as Adam left the house and drove off, Emily grabbed her keys, her bag, and followed him. She kept a safe distance, ensuring he wouldn't notice her. Her heart pounded wildly, but she couldn't let fear stop her. His route led through the city, but instead of stopping at an office as he had claimed, Adam turned into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. He parked in front of a small house with light green walls. Emily pulled over a little further down the street, far enough to remain unnoticed. A few minutes later, the front door of the house opened, and out stepped Belinda, the same woman Emily had seen at the supermarket. Behind her, Lucas came running out, beaming with joy, and threw himself into Adam's arms. Adam greeted him with a warm hug and then kissed Belinda lightly on the cheek. Emily watched this unfold from her car, as if frozen in time. Everything she saw confirmed her worst fears. Adam behaved as though this woman and child were his real family. A few moments later, the three of them got into Adam's car and drove off. Emily started her engine and followed them. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly as she trailed them to their next destination, a small, cozy restaurant not far away. She parked in the lot, careful to stay out of sight, and watched through the restaurant's large windows. Inside, Adam, Belinda, and Lucas sat at a table near the window. They laughed, talked, and interacted like a happy family. Adam helped Lucas cut his food and wiped his face with a napkin, while Belinda looked at them with the kind of affection that used to belong only to Emily. Emily quietly took out her phone and snapped a few pictures. She knew these images would be crucial if things escalated. Her hands trembled as she captured the scene, but she forced herself to continue, knowing she needed this evidence. When dinner was over, Adam drove Belinda and Lucas back to the greenhouse. He hugged Lucas goodnight and kissed Belinda once more before heading back to his car. Emily sat in her vehicle watching as Adam drove off in the opposite direction. That was the final straw for her. Her husband was living a full, hidden life that she had never been part of. Emily remained in her car for several minutes after Adam disappeared from view. She was overwhelmed by feelings of humiliation, anger, and heartbreak. She couldn't contain it any longer. She knew she had to act. That night, Emily made up her mind. The time for silent observation was over. It was time for confrontation. That evening, Emily gathered her thoughts and prepared for the conversation she could no longer avoid. On the kitchen table before her was a folder filled with all the evidence she had collected over the past few days. Inside were the photos from the restaurant, screenshots of messages from Adam's phone, and financial statements. Together, they painted a clear picture of the double life Adam had been leading for years. Adam returned home later than usual. He looked calm as always, as though the day had been no different from any other. His usual warm smile at the door was just part of the routine, but to Emily it now felt hollow. She asked him to sit at the table, skipping their usual pleasantries. The folder lay in front of him. Adam looked at it with mild curiosity at first, but as he opened it and began flipping through its contents, his expression changed. At first, there was confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a dawning sense of panic. The photos showed him with Belinda and Lucas in various places, the restaurant, outside the house, on a park bench. The messages revealed his emotional connection to Belinda and his promises to Lucas. Every word and every image in the folder was damning. There was no way to explain it away. Emily sat in silence, watching him. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed the storm of emotions raging within. She gave him no opportunity to distract or deflect. Adam tried to say something. His first words were, "It's not what it looks like," followed by a stammered, "I never wanted to hurt you." But these excuses sounded weak and meaningless. Under the weight of the undeniable evidence, Adam finally admitted the truth. He confessed that his relationship with Belinda had started a few years ago. At first, it was strictly professional, but over time, it had grown into something deeper. He admitted that Lucas was, in fact, his son, a revelation that left Emily stunned. This wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was a secret life he had nurtured and kept hidden for years. Emily listened in silence as Adam explained himself. She showed no reaction, her face a mask of cold detachment. Inside, however, she felt a maelstrom of anger, heartbreak, and betrayal. This was the man she had trusted completely, the father of her children, the center of her world, and he had been living a lie. When Adam finished his confession, a heavy silence fell over the room. He stood up and tried to approach her, but Emily instinctively stepped back. Her body was tense, her fists clenched. Her mind replayed everything she had seen, heard, and discovered over the past days. Adam pleaded with her, saying he wanted to make things right. He talked about their family, about how much he loved her and the kids, and about how he wanted to fix what he had broken. But his words rang hollow. Emily could no longer trust the man who had deceived her so profoundly. The conversation ended much as it had begun, in silence. Adam retreated to the bedroom, leaving Emily standing in the kitchen. She stayed there, motionless, staring at the folder on the table. Her mind swirled with the events of the evening, the weight of Adam's betrayal pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. That night marked a turning point for Emily. She knew that their life would never be the same again. The foundation of trust and love she had built her world upon was gone, leaving only uncertainty in its place. When the silence after the confrontation engulfed the house, the tension between Emily and Adam continued to grow. She remained in the kitchen, standing by the table where just minutes earlier the evidence of his betrayal had lain. Adam, visibly shaken and tense, tried to regain control of the situation. His attempts to justify himself no longer worked. Emily was silent, but her mind raced, revisiting every lie, every betrayal, and every missed sign over the years. Adam made an effort to diffuse the situation by stepping closer to her. He started talking about their family, about the children, and about his desire to repair what he had broken. But his words didn't reach Emily. She heard them, but they were empty, devoid of meaning. All she could see in front of her was the man who had been destroying her life piece by piece while she had been living in a blissful illusion. On the kitchen table was a knife she had used earlier to prepare dinner. Its cold, metallic blade caught the faint light of the kitchen lamp. Emily hadn't even noticed it until Adam tried to place a hand on her shoulder. In an emotional outburst, Emily lost control. The next moment, she realized something irreversible had happened. Adam collapsed to the floor, and the silence in the room became deafening. A minute passed, then another. For Emily, time seemed to stretch into eternity. Her mind struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. She hadn't planned this. It was impulsive, uncontrollable, and now she was left to face the consequences. She dropped to her knees beside Adam, but it was already too late. His face had gone pale, his body lifeless. The reality of what had happened hit her like a wave. Panic started to take over as she stood and began pacing the kitchen, desperately searching for a way to undo the irreversible. She glanced at her reflection in the window, but the woman staring back at her was unrecognizable. This wasn't the Emily she had always thought she was. Suddenly there was a noise, a faint knock at the door. Her heart froze. At first she thought it might be her imagination, but the knock came again, louder this time. It was their neighbor, George, who had heard the commotion in the kitchen and decided to check if everything was all right. Emily couldn't bring herself to respond. She stood still, rooted to the spot, as George knocked harder. "Everything okay in there?" he called out. His voice was kind but persistent. Emily knew that if she didn't answer her, it would only raise more suspicion. She cautiously approached the door and opened it a crack. George immediately noticed that something was wrong. Her hands were trembling, her face pale, her eyes distant and unfocused. He glanced past her into the kitchen and saw Adam's body on the floor. "Emily, what happened?" he asked. But she said nothing. Words failed her. She couldn't explain the unexplainable. George reached for his phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, police cars with flashing lights arrived at the house. Emily stood in the kitchen, watching as her life completely unraveled before her eyes. The officers entered the house and quickly assessed the scene. She didn't resist as they approached her. She simply raised her trembling hands, understanding that this was the end. On the kitchen floor, a knife was carefully collected as evidence. One of the officers checked Adam's pulse and then shook his head, signaling that it was too late to save him. The children, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded, were still asleep in their rooms upstairs. One of the officers quietly went to check on them, finding them safe and undisturbed. It was decided that they wouldn't be woken until representatives from Child Protective Services arrived to take temporary custody of them. Emily was arrested on the spot. She didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even speak. Her hands were cuffed, and she followed the officers to the waiting police car in silence. She didn't look at the neighbors who had gathered outside, didn't respond to their whispers and stares. Her gaze remained fixed ahead on a future that had now been reduced to ashes. As the police car drove away, the quiet neighborhood, once peaceful and uneventful, was left to grapple with the shock of what had just happened. At the police station, Emily sat at a cold metal table, waiting for the questioning to begin. Her hands were still trembling, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over. She thought of her children, of her marriage, of the life she had believed was real. Now it was all gone. At the police station, Emily was placed in an interrogation room, sitting alone at a metal table. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Her hands rested on the table, still trembling slightly. She didn't cry, didn't scream. Her mind was consumed by flashes of the past, her wedding day, the birth of her children, the vacations and celebrations that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. When the officers finally began their questioning, they already had more than enough evidence to build a case. Emily's own words, her confession at the scene, and the damning folder of documents were more than enough to seal her fate. The story was clear. A betrayal so deep, a pain so overwhelming, that it had led her to an act she never thought herself capable of. But while the facts of the case were straightforward, the emotions behind it were anything but. The officers knew they weren't just dealing with a crime, they were dealing with a life that had been shattered into pieces, taking everyone involved down with it. Back at the house, representatives from Child Protective Services arrived to collect Emily's children. The two were still groggy, having just been woken up, and asked where their mother and father were. The social workers, struggling to mask their emotions, told them that they were being taken somewhere safe for now. The children didn't understand, but they sensed something was wrong. For the neighbors, the tragedy was almost incomprehensible. Emily had always seemed like a loving mother, a kind and devoted wife. How could she have done something so unimaginable? George, who had known the family for years, kept repeating the same thing to the officers. "I just can't believe it. I thought they were the perfect couple." But the perfect couple was no more. The suburban dream had crumbled, leaving behind only the ruins of a family torn apart by lies, betrayal, and violence. For Emily, the road ahead was clear. The law would take its course. But for her children, for Adam's other family, and for those who had witnessed the fallout, the scars of that night would remain forever. Emily sat alone in the interrogation room, waiting for the next step. Her life, once so steady and predictable, had unraveled completely. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. The trial of Emily captured the attention not just of the local community, but became one of the most talked about cases in the state. From the moment news of her arrest broke to the day the verdict was delivered, people speculated about how a seemingly perfect family could end in such a tragic way. For some, it was the story of a woman broken by betrayal. For others, it was a crime for which there could be no excuse. Emily appeared in court emotionless. Her face remained as cold and empty as it had been on the night of her arrest. Prosecutors built their case on hard evidence: her confession, the neighbor's testimony, and the photographs of the crime scene. They didn't need to dive into her motives. The facts alone spoke volumes. The defense, on the other hand, focused on portraying Emily as a victim of circumstances. Her lawyer argued that Adam's betrayal had caused years of psychological anguish, which had built up until it finally erupted in a moment of uncontrollable rage. He highlighted how Emily had no history of violence, how she had been a loving wife and mother, and how the discovery of Adam's double life had shattered her emotionally. Witnesses testified in court, including George, the neighbor who had called the police. He described hearing sounds from the kitchen and finding Emily with blood on her hands and Adam lying on the floor. His testimony was clear and emotionally neutral, but it solidified Emily's guilt in the eyes of the jury. The most pivotal part of the trial came when Emily's own words were played back. During her initial police interrogation, she had confessed, stating plainly that she had done it because of Adam's betrayal and that she couldn't take it anymore. Her voice in the recording was calm, almost resigned. There was no rage, no sadness, just a factual recounting of what had happened. After several weeks, the jury reached their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Emily to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision, while expected, still sent ripples of emotion through the courtroom. Emily and Adam's children were placed in the care of relatives. Their world was forever changed. They had lost both parents, one to death, the other to a prison cell. For them, the tragedy was something they couldn't fully understand, a wound they would carry for the rest of their lives. Emily, through her lawyers, made a heartfelt request to shield the children from the media and public attention, knowing they were the ones who had suffered the most. Belinda, the other woman in Adam's life, also faced the fallout. She was left to raise Lucas on her own, without the man who had been a central figure in their lives. The stigma of her involvement in the affair followed her everywhere, even though she hadn't committed any crime. The community whispered about her role in the tragedy, making her a pariah in her own right. For Emily, life behind bars became a new reality. In the beginning, she was kept isolated from other inmates due to her fragile emotional state. She barely spoke, spending most of her time in solitude. Memories of her former life played on a loop in her mind. The laughter of her children, the early days of her marriage to Adam, the moments of happiness that now felt like they belonged to someone else. These memories became both her comfort and her punishment. Months passed, and life outside moved on. The neighbors who once discussed the tragic events began to forget, turning their attention to other matters. The community healed, but for those directly affected, the scars remained. This story serves as a sobering reminder of how fragile even the strongest seeming relationships can be. It underscores the importance of communication and seeking help in times of emotional turmoil, rather than allowing pain to fester. For Emily, Adam, their children, Belinda, and Lucas, the tragedy left an indelible mark that could never be erased. It was a tale of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of a single moment of lost control. There were no winners, only broken lives and a haunting silence where happiness had once lived.